everyone. Today we are going to be reading out of Mark chapter 13, starting with verse 14 and going through 23. Bear with me with my small font here. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that it may not happen in winter. For those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard, I have told you all things beforehand.
That usually helps. So this morning we are going to pick up where we left off before I went on vacation. So if you're expecting a Thanksgiving Day sermon, I apologize. I think you all know how to be thankful, right? So instead, we're going to talk about the abomination of desolation. This is one of those kind of weird, mysterious parts of the Bible that we're not always quite sure what to do with, and so hopefully this morning we'll have a little bit better understanding as to what this means and what to expect. I try to strike a balance in my sermons between information and application. However, there's only so much I can do with certain texts, and so this one is going to be very information heavy. This is not going to be one of those like 5 steps to a better marriage sermon. So with that being said, I've got a lot to cover, so we're going to jump right in. The first part to understanding the Bible is to knowing its context. So let me quickly summarize what we talked about 2 weeks ago at the beginning of Mark chapter 13. This is during the Holy Week, just a few days before Christ's death. In Mark 13:1, Jesus and his disciples walk out of the temple, and one of the disciples turns around and is like, wow, Jesus, isn't this so beautiful? Like, look at how great this is. Look at how big these stones are, these massive walls. And Jesus says in verse 2, do you see this great building? There will not be one stone left upon another that will not be torn down. So that's a pretty big deal, right? The temple is the center of Jewish life and religion. And Jesus is saying, yeah, pretty soon it's going to get destroyed. It's going to be gone. Every one of those stones is going to come toppling down. So as you would expect, the disciples have some follow-up questions. They're like, we want to know, when is this going to happen? And what are the signs? Meaning, what should we look for that will lead up to these events so we can know when this is going to happen? And so Jesus goes on to say, right, you're going to see wars, you're going to see rumors of wars, you're going to see earthquakes, all these things that we normally associate with like end time stuff. But he says, that's not the end. That's just the beginning of the birth pains. And then he warns them that, right, people are going to turn against you. You're going to be dragged before rulers and before kings because of your faith. But they have a central mission. He says, don't lose focus of this. The gospel must be proclaimed to all of the nations. So regardless of what happens, keep preaching the gospel. And so that brings us up to verse 14, where Jesus says, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not be, let the reader understand. That phrase, abomination of desolation, is more literally translated, the abomination that leads to desolation. So an abomination is something that is evil or morally repugnant. In the Old Testament, there seems to be kind of two general categories where the word abomination is attributed. It's either something that just so grossly defies the natural order, or it's some kind of idolatry. It's the worship of false gods. And as we'll see in a moment here, this one is most likely referring to that second category, that it's going to be some kind of act of idolatry, of false worship, that is going to lead to desolation, that is going to cause something being destroyed, left completely desolate, right? Nothing remaining. But he continues to say, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter the house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. For alas, the women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in these days. Pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation of God, or from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. Right? So he's saying that when this happens, flee to the mountains. Run as far as you can. Don't turn back to try to save the cat, right? Don't go back for your favorite blanket, right? Whatever, if you don't, whatever you forgot, it's too late. Just run as far as you can and pray that you can escape this event. Now, Jesus says, in the ESV puts it in parentheses to kind of help us understand Jesus' thought here. He says, let the reader understand. This is something that the Jews would have understood quite well. So I want to take the bulk of this morning to help us understand what did Jesus mean when he used this phrase, the abomination of desolation. First thing we have to realize is that Jesus did not invent this term. This is not original to him. Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament prophet Daniel. If you've ever read through the book of Daniel, the first half is a bunch of stories, like Daniel in the lion's den. The second half is all prophecy that lines up very much with like the book of Revelation. And in those prophecies, there are 3 different times when Daniel refers to this event of the abomination of desolation. Starting in Daniel chapter 9, this might get a little confusing, so try to stay with me here. Daniel 9 talks about what he refers to as the 70 weeks. And it's this vision that he gets from God. And these 70 weeks are supposed to lead to the end of sin, right? When the righteousness is going to come in. Basically, the end of these 70 weeks is going to come the final judgment where God is going to judge sin and he's going to rescue the righteous. And so basically, he lays out this timeline. And so this 70 weeks begins with the proclamation from the king that the temple, which was previously destroyed by the Babylonians, was going to be rebuilt. So there's going to be a declaration to rebuild the temple, to the completion of the temple, to the coming of the anointed one, which is the Christ, this Messiah figure, which was fulfilled in Jesus. And at the end of at the end of 69 weeks, it says that the anointed one is going to be cut off, right? And then there's going to be a gap before we get to that final 70th week. And the way that this works out, again, I can't explain all of this to you right now because we don't have time for that, but go read it for yourself. If you lay out the timeline and you compare the dates from history, what you see is that each day in those 70 weeks correlates to 1 year. So a week out of Daniel's 70 weeks is referring to a time span of 7 years. And you can lay out the numbers, and what you get from the decree that is issued to rebuild the temple until the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus is approximately, I think, what is the number here? 483 years, which is what you get when you multiply 69 times 7. Right, this is not like controversial stuff. It works. You can go do it for yourself. You can do the math, lay out the numbers, right? what Daniel prophesied then came true, and it is a great testament to the truth of the Bible. But then he talks about the 70th week in Daniel 9:27. It says, and he, who he refers early to as the prince, the New Testament is going to give this figure the titles of the Antichrist or the man of lawlessness. It says, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, this 70th week. And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decree end is poured out on the desolator. So there's 69 weeks leading up to Jesus, and then the anointed one is cut off, right? Jesus is no longer with us. This is what we'd call the church age. But then there's going to be this future 70th week, this time period of 7 years. And during these 7 years, there's going to be this prince, this mysterious figure, who is going to make a covenant, some kind of an alliance or a peace treaty. And then halfway through, at the 3.5-year point, he's going to break that covenant, and he's going to cut off the sacrifices in Jerusalem. And he's going to bring the abomination that will make desolate. We fast forward to Daniel 11:31. It says, forces from him shall come and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offerings, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So same thing repeated, but this time it tells us specifically that it's going to be in the temple. Daniel 12:11 and 12, it says, and from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and to the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. 1,290 days is approximately 3.5 years, just like Daniel 9:27 talks about. Now, what's the difference between the 45 days and those two numbers? I have no idea. If you have an answer for that, I'd love to hear it. And so when we put these together, we get this picture that this abomination of desolation is going to be some kind of evil act of idolatry where this figure is going to come in the middle of the 7.5-year time period, and he's going to desecrate the temple. And then approximately 3.5 years after that is going to bring about the final judgment that we see in Revelation chapter 19. Now, if we look through history in the year 167 AD, there was a Greek ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes who took over Jerusalem, and he declared that everyone must now worship his God. And he banned them from practicing their own sacrifices, from circumcising their children, from gathering on the Sabbath, basically everything that made them Jewish. And then he marched into the holy place where he, as a Gentile, was not allowed to go. And he sacrificed a pig, an unclean animal, on the altar of God to Zeus, which is probably the most offensive thing that you can possibly do to the Jewish people. And so in the times of Jesus, if you were to ask any Jew walking around what was the abomination of desolation, they would point to Antiochus Epiphanes, right? This was the thing that started off the whole Maccabean revolts and led to the Jews gaining their independence for about 150 years. They were taught that story as children the same way that we were taught stories like the Boston Tea Party, right? It's just so ingrained in their culture. They're like, yeah, Daniel was fulfilled in 167 BC. But now Jesus in 30-ish AD is saying that the abomination of desolation has yet to come, which means one of two things has to be true. Either what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes was not the actual abomination of desolation, or there's going to be a second one. So fast forward again to the year 70 AD, and we see the Jews are in the middle of another revolt, this time against the Romans. And there's this young Roman general named Titus who is the son of the newly appointed emperor, and who would about 10 years later go on to become emperor of Rome himself. And so, again, the Romans are battling the Jewish people, and Titus goes to his dad, "I'll make you proud, Dad, watch me." And so he marches his army into Israel. And in April of 70 AD, he lays siege to the city. If you know anything about Jewish culture, April is when Passover took place. And at Passover, it was customary that every Jew who was able would make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So there were millions of Jews who did not normally live there that were in the city at that time. And so Titus waited till millions of them gathered together, and then he surrounded the city and began to attack it. And he sieged the city for 3 months until August 30th, or 70 AD. He was finally able to breach the final walls to get through to the fortress, where he burned down the entire city. And he tore the temple apart. He looted the temple and took everything out of it. And he tore all of the walls down, and every stone in the temple he tore apart so he could melt the gold off of the roof. This is a picture of the rocks from the temple walls that are still there in Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years later. You can go and touch those rocks today. It's still there as evidence of what happened in 70 AD. And so along with burning down the city and looting and destroying the temple, he also slaughtered approximately 1 million Jews at that time. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was also a captain in the Jewish army during that war against the Romans, tells us that it was the Christians who heeded the words of Jesus and recognized that the event was coming. And while every other Jew was going to hide in the city behind their big walls, the Christians fled to the mountains, just like Jesus told them. So the Christians were not part of that slaughter of 1 million people. When Titus returned to Rome, they built this giant arch in celebration of his victory. You can go to Rome today and still see that arch standing 2,000 years later, which is incredible because we can't make roads that last longer than 3 years. On the inside of the arch are pictures and inscriptions that depict the Greeks sacking Jerusalem and looting the temple. So if you see like the menorah, that's the candle stand, right? That is literally a picture of them hauling all of the things out of the temple as a testament to what Jesus said did actually come true. So the question is that the abomination of desolation? It depends who you ask. This is one of those things, what I'm about to talk about right now, that is highly disputed, right? There are godly men and women who fall on all sides of this discussion. If you disagree with anything that I say this week or next week, it's okay. I'd love to have the conversation with you if you have studied through this before, but this is a secondary issue. This is not one of the things that defines us as a Christian, and I think there's some room for disagreement on this. But when you look at the events of 70 AD, and it checks off an awful lot of the boxes very accurately, right? And keep in mind that Jesus said that every one of these stones in the temple was going to come down. And I just showed you the pictures of the pile of stones that are still there. So this was absolutely a fulfillment of the prophecy that Jesus gave in verse 2. In other places in the Gospels, he prophesied at the same time that there would be a genocide of the Jewish people that was undisputably fulfilled, that what Jesus said came true in 70 AD. And it checks a lot of the boxes about this description of the abomination of desolation. The problem is that there's a few boxes that it does not check. As I read to you before, Daniel placed a lot of emphasis on this time period of 7 years and the 3.5 years. And it's unclear as to how the events of 70 AD fit into what happened or fits into that 7-year time period. Also, he said that the 70 weeks were supposed to lead to the end of sin, right? And that basically the final judgment, that Daniel explicitly ties these into what's known as the day of the Lord, which is the final judgment of Christ, where every sinner will be judged and every saint will be rescued and rewarded. That doesn't quite fit with the events of 70 AD. Also, in Daniel 12, verse 2, it says that, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." So in Daniel 12, he links the abomination of desolation to the resurrection. And then even the parts in Matthew 13 that we're going to cover next week, but let me see here. In verse 24, he says, "In those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And he will send out his angels and gather his elect." Right? That's language of the rapture. So both Daniel and Jesus connect the abomination of desolation to the second coming, and to the rapture, and to the resurrection. Did the resurrection of the dead happen in 70 AD? No, it did not. So is 70 AD the abomination of desolation? Kind of. To understand this, we need to understand an important tool when reading scriptures, and specifically prophecy, and this is what's known as a double fulfillment. Let me just read a definition here for you. This is from the website called gotquestions.org, which I highly recommend, but it defines a double fulfillment is the circumstance in which the prophecy has both a short-term and long-term fulfillment. The prophecy is made, and the first fulfillment comes to pass relatively soon thereafter. Later, there is a second fulfillment to the prophecy, and that second fulfillment is usually fuller and more literal. So there is a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. Some examples of this throughout the Bible would be Isaiah 7 talks about the virgin, or the maiden who's going to give birth. And that was fulfilled during the lifetime of Isaiah as a sign to the queen, to the king, that some young maiden would give birth. But then it was also fulfilled in Jesus with the Immaculate Conception with Mary. 2 Samuel 7, God makes a promise to King David. It says that your offspring will succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build my house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. That was fulfilled by his son Solomon, who built the temple for God. But then it was also fulfilled by Jesus, who is going to sit on that throne. So this idea of a double fulfillment is not like a super controversial thing when it comes to reading the Bible. We see it all throughout scriptures. And so when we apply it to this passage in Mark 13, we see that Jesus is talking about two separate events. He predicts the fall of Jerusalem, which absolutely happened in 70 AD, but then he also predicts his second coming in him rapturing and taking up his saints to himself, which did not happen in 70 AD. So what we get here is that the events of 70 AD are a partial fulfillment. They are a picture of a more fuller fulfillment that has yet to happen. It is a type of an abomination of desolation. So we can look back at the events of 70 AD and even 167 AD, and what we see are pictures of the future events that are going to happen. I want to keep reading in verses Mark 13, 21 and 23, and it says, "And then if anyone looks to you and says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'Look, there he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all of these things beforehand. So not only does he predict the fall of Jerusalem, but he also predicts that there's going to be a lot of false teachers that say, yeah, I'm Jesus. I'm the reincarnation of Jesus, or the second coming of Jesus, or I'm the new Messiah. And we have historical records that the first century was full of false messiahs, right? And even shortly after Jesus, there were people claiming to be the next Jesus. That happened in the lifetime of the disciples. That also continues to happen today. There's a woman in China right now who claims to be the reincarnated Jesus. The dictator of Ethiopia in the 1920s claimed to be the second coming of Jesus and started a movement called Rastafarianism, which is what Bob Marley was a part of. Right? We've seen this all throughout history. There have been lots of people that have claimed to be Jesus, and there's going to be more in the future. And as we approach the end times, all of these things that Jesus has predicted are just going to intensify, and they're going to happen again with greater frequency and greater severity. And so when we look at the events that have happened in the past, and right, we have predictive models of what's going to happen. That what happened in 167 BC was a picture of what is going to happen in the future. What happened in 70 AD seemed to be kind of a ramping up. It was even worse than what happened in 167 AD, where 1 million people were killed. But Jesus also said that such tribulation has never been seen since God created the world and will never be seen again. Have we seen genocides of 1 million people before? Yes, we have. It's terrible. It's tragic. But it's not exactly unprecedented, which means that what's coming in the future, this abomination of desolation that Jesus is predicting, is going to be some kind of event, some kind of desecration of God's temple, of God's people, that's going to precede the second coming. Again, what are you supposed to do with this for your life? Again, this isn't the most applicable thing other than we are promised that things are going to get worse before they get better. And then we just go back to what we talked about 2 weeks ago, right? That the gospel must go out to all the nations. That regardless of what's happening right now, regardless of whether the Antichrist is here already or not, that doesn't change the fact that we are told to prepare. And what we're going to read next week, Jesus places such a huge emphasis of be watchful, be awake, look around, know what's going on, right? Because these things matter, and he's telling us to be watchful for these things. And the way that we do that is not by digging our heads in the sand and just saying, well, I'm just going to stay here with myself. I've got my little church. I don't need to do anything. So, no, we have a world around us that is lost and that is awaiting judgment unless we share the good news with them.